I'm going to tell you something that happened to me and my partner during our winter patrol way out in the northern wilderness. Believe it or not, I'm telling you exactly what we saw and did. This was 3 winters ago, and I still think about it every single day. We'd been out in the remote territory for 4 days, checking on isolated cabins and winter trails after one of the worst snowstorms we'd seen in years. The storm had dropped nearly 3 feet of snow all across the region, and our job was to make sure no one was stranded, check for storm damage, and assess how the wildlife was handling the brutal conditions. The cold that week was unlike anything I'd experienced in my 2 years as a ranger. We're talking -25 during the day, probably pushing -40 at night with the wind chill. The kind of cold where your breath instantly freezes and drops to the ground like snow, where exposed skin can get frostbite in under 5 minutes, where even the trees crack and pop from the freeze. My partner had been doing this job for 15 years. He'd seen everything the wilderness could throw at you. Avalanches, flash floods, bear attacks, people lost for weeks in zero visibility conditions. Nothing fazed him anymore. He moved through that frozen landscape like it was his natural habitat, reading signs in the snow and ice that I was still learning to recognize. We were about 40 miles from the nearest maintained road, following what used to be an old logging trail, but was now just a gap between trees. The snow was knee-deep in most places, deeper in drifts where the wind had piled it against fallen logs and rock outcroppings. Our snowshoes were the only thing keeping us from sinking completely. And even then, every step was an effort. The silence out there was absolute, not just quiet. Silent in a way that made your ears ring. No birds, no wind, no distant traffic, just the crunch of snow under our feet and the sound of our own breathing. When you stopped moving, you could hear your heartbeat, your pulse in your ears. It was the kind of silence that makes you whisper, even when there's no reason to be quiet. We were checking for animal sign, looking for tracks and trails to assess how the local wildlife was coping with the severe weather. The deer were bunched up in the densest cover they could find. We'd found some elk tracks, but they were old, from before the last snowfall. Most of the smaller animals seemed to have burrowed deep into whatever shelter they could find and were hunkering down for the worst. That's when we started noticing the strange tracks. At first, my partner thought they might be from a really big bear. The tracks were huge, much bigger than anything we'd seen before, but bears do get big in this part of the country. The weird thing was how fresh they were. Most bears should have been in their dens weeks ago, deep in hibernation. Finding tracks this time of year, especially in these conditions, just didn't make sense. The tracks were also spaced oddly. Too far apart for a normal walking bear, but not quite right for a running bear either. And there was something about the shape that bothered my partner. He kept kneeling down to examine them closer, measuring them with his gloved hands, taking pictures with his phone. We followed the trail for maybe half a mile. It led through some of the densest woods in the area, places where the snow wasn't as deep, because the tree canopy had caught most of it. Whoever or whatever had made these tracks knew the terrain well, taking the path of least resistance through the wilderness like an expert tracker. The tracks led us to a section of forest that felt different somehow, older. The trees were massive here, old growth that had somehow escaped the logging operations of past decades. Some of them had to be 3 or 4 feet wide at the base, towering into the grey sky like natural monuments. The silence here was even deeper, more intense. That's when we heard the first sound. It came from maybe a quarter-mile ahead, echoing off the massive tree trunks and bouncing around until we couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. It wasn't exactly a roar. It wasn't exactly a scream. Something between pain and rage, but deeper than anything I'd ever heard. It made something primal in my brain stir and start screaming that we needed to run. My partner stopped dead and held up his hand for silence. We'd both heard bears many times before. We'd heard wolves, mountain lions, elk in rut. This was different. This was something massive in serious distress, and it was close enough that we could feel the sound as much as hear it. The sound came again, longer this time, more desperate. It was definitely coming from ahead of us, in the direction the tracks were leading. My partner looked at me and I could see him weighing our options. We were armed, both carrying handguns, and he had a rifle. But against something that could make a sound like that, I wasn't sure the guns would matter much. We moved forward slowly, moving from tree to tree, using the massive trunks for cover. The tracks in the snow were becoming more erratic now, deeper in places, as if whatever was making them was stumbling. There were other marks too, scrape marks on tree bark, broken branches, places where something large had been thrown or had fallen with enough force to leave impressions in the snow. The sound came a third time, weaker now, but still carrying that note of pain and rage. We were getting close to whatever was making it. My partner motioned for me to stay back while he went ahead to scout. I watched him disappear behind a stand of pines, heard his sharp intake of breath, then his urgent gesture for me to come closer. The scene that greeted us in that clearing is seared into my memory forever. Blood everywhere on the snow. Dark red splotches scattered across maybe 50 feet, some of them steaming slightly in the frigid air. The bark of the trees was ripped off in long strips, hanging like ribbons from trunks that were 2 feet thick. Branches the size of a man's leg were snapped and hanging, some of them 20 feet off the ground. The snow was churned up like a battlefield, compacted and stained in a pattern that spoke of a massive, violent struggle. And there, about 40 feet away, was a grizzly bear, dead. Its massive body was crumpled against a fallen log, neck clearly broken, head twisted at an unnatural angle. This was no ordinary bear. It was enormous, probably close to 600 pounds, an old male in his prime. The kind of bear that was the apex predator in these woods, that nothing else would dare challenge. But that wasn't what made us freeze in our tracks and forget how to breathe. Sitting propped against a large pine, maybe 30 feet from the dead bear, was something I never imagined I'd see outside of blurry photos and campfire stories. 8 feet tall, even sitting down, covered head to toe in dark brown hair that was matted with blood and snow. His shoulders were wider than any human's, wider than they had any right to be. His arms were longer than they should be, hanging past where his knees would be if he was standing. The face was the worst part. It was like looking at something that was almost human, but had taken a different evolutionary path millions of years ago. The brow ridge was massive, jutting out over eyes that were sunken and intelligent. The nose was flat, almost pig-like, but the mouth was somewhere between human and ape. As it breathed, I could see teeth that were designed for more than just eating plants. It was watching us, had probably been watching us since we entered the clearing. Those eyes tracked our every move, calculating, deciding if we were a threat or just another curiosity. There was intelligence there, unmistakable intelligence, but alien enough that I couldn't predict what it might do next. The creature's breath was labored, visible in the cold air. I could see fresh blood soaking into the fur on its side, saw more blood dripping from one of its legs. Whatever had happened between this creature and that grizzly bear, it had left them both badly injured, except only one of them was still alive. My partner and I stood completely still. Any sudden movement could trigger an attack, and if this thing could kill a 600-pound grizzly, we wouldn't stand a chance. But we couldn't just back away either. We were in the open now, and something told me turning our backs on this creature would be a fatal mistake. For a solid minute, the three of us just stared at each other. The being seemed to be assessing us in the same way we were assessing it. It didn't attack, didn't make any aggressive moves. It just watched us with those deep, intelligent eyes. Finally, my partner did something I still can't believe he had the guts to do. Slowly, very slowly, he took off his pack. His movements were deliberate, not threatening. The creature watched him but didn't react. He opened the pack and pulled out our first aid kit. Still moving with that same deliberate slowness, he took 3 steps forward, not directly at the creature, but to the side, giving it space, showing that he wasn't a threat. He placed the first aid kit on the snow between them, then stepped back. The creature watched all of this with what I can only describe as astonishment. Its eyes went from the kit to my partner and back. I could almost see the gears turning behind those eyes, trying to figure out what was happening. Why weren't these little two-legged beings running away? Why were they offering help? After what felt like an eternity, the creature leaned forward. The movement caused it obvious pain. I could see it tense up, saw blood run more freely from its wounds. But it reached out and grabbed the first aid kit with a hand that was easily 3 times the size of mine. It looked at the contents, and I swear I saw recognition on its face. It knew what these things were, or at least understood that they were for treating wounds. What happened next was even more surprising. The creature began to treat its own wounds. It used the gauze to press against the worst of the bleeding on its side, holding pressure like a human would. When the bleeding slowed, it picked up the antiseptic, cautiously sniffed it, then poured it directly into the wound. The muscles in its entire body tensed at what must have been incredible pain, but it made no sound. No cry, no roar. It just stoically endured the pain, waiting for it to pass. We stood there for maybe 20 minutes, watching as the creature tended to itself. It used almost all the supplies we had, wrapping the worst wounds with bandages that its large fingers manipulated with surprising dexterity. When it was finished, it looked back at us, and there was something different in its expression. Not exactly gratitude, that seemed too human an emotion to attribute to this thing, but definitely recognition, understanding. It had allowed us to approach, had accepted our help, and now both sides knew something fundamental had changed. The creature slowly stood up, favoring its injured leg. Standing, it was even more imposing than it had seemed sitting. Easily 8 to 9 feet tall, with shoulders so wide they seemed to take up half the clearing. It could have killed us with hardly any effort, but instead it turned and began to limp away. After a few steps, it stopped and looked back. The meaning was clear. Follow me. My partner and I exchanged glances. This had gone beyond anything we were trained for, beyond any protocol that existed for rangers. But we also knew we were witnessing something extraordinary, something perhaps no other modern human had experienced. We followed. The creature led us deeper into the woods, moving with purpose despite its injuries. It took the easiest path through the terrain, avoiding the deepest snowdrifts, using rock outcroppings and fallen trees for stability. The journey took maybe 45 minutes. My partner and I kept a respectful distance behind it, ready to back off if it showed any sign of aggression, but it never did. It occasionally glanced back to make sure we were still following, but otherwise seemed focused on getting wherever it was going. Eventually we came to a sheer rock face, the kind of geological formation that had probably been there for millions of years. The creature approached what looked like just another section of the cliff, covered with hanging branches and dead vegetation. But as it pulled aside the camouflage, it revealed the entrance to a cave. The opening was large enough for it to pass through, but we would have to duck. The creature went inside, disappeared into the darkness, then emerged a moment later with what I can only describe as crutches. There were 2 long, thick branches that had been worked on somehow, smoothed and shaped to fit comfortably under its arms. There was even some kind of padding on the tops, probably moss or grass, to make them more comfortable. Using these crutches, the creature could move without putting so much weight on its injured leg. It motioned for us to enter, a gesture that was unmistakably human in its intent. My partner turned on his flashlight, and we went in. The entrance tunnel extended about 20 feet, then opened into something much larger. The creature disappeared again for a moment, and then the cave was illuminated with a dim light. It had lit some kind of torch, a long branch wrapped in something that burned slowly and produced a steady light. It carried this back to the entrance, picked it up again, retrieved its crutches, and led us deeper into what was clearly a cave system. What we found when we reached the main chamber stopped us both dead in our tracks. This wasn't just a cave where some animal had taken shelter. This was a home. The space was larger than most apartments, a natural cavern that opened into multiple chambers and alcoves. But it was what the creature had done with the space that astonished us. The walls were decorated with arrangements of sticks and stones, patterns that were clearly intentional and artistic. Some were simple geometric designs. Others were more complex, almost like primitive murals telling stories I couldn't understand. Along one wall, different types of leaves and moss had been arranged in what looked like a sorting system. Some were fresh, others were dried and preserved, ordered by color and texture like a natural library. There were sections for different types of bark, different kinds of stones, even what looked like collections of different animal hides and feathers. The floor was covered with woven mats made from grass and thin branches, intricate patterns that must have taken hours to create. In one corner was what could only be described as a bed. Layers of pine boughs that had been carefully selected and arranged, covered with soft herbs and what looked like pieces of fur from various animals. It looked comfortable, designed for something of the creature's size and proportions, but it was the tools that really made clear the intelligence we were dealing with. Sharpened stones that had been worked into specific shapes, some clearly for cutting, others for scraping or digging. Pieces of wood that had been carved and shaped for particular purposes, some of them showing wear patterns from regular use. Everything showed signs of planning, of a creature that thought about problems and created solutions. There were also food preparation areas, flat stones that had been arranged like primitive countertops with cutting tools laid out nearby, clay pots that had been hand-molded and somehow hardened, likely for storing water or food. Even what looked like a rudimentary fire pit area where fires could be safely built without filling the cave with smoke. The creature made its way to the sleeping area and collapsed onto it with obvious relief. It arranged the crutches within reach and looked back at us. And for the first time since we'd found it, I saw something akin to peace on its expression. It was home, in its own space, surrounded by things it had made with its own hands. My partner and I stood there for a few minutes, taking in the magnitude of what we had discovered. This wasn't just some unknown animal. This was a being with culture, with intelligence, with the ability to modify its environment in sophisticated ways. The implications were staggering. The creature was watching us examine its home, and I had the feeling it was proud of what it had created. There was something almost human in the way it seemed to be showing off its accomplishments, like a homeowner giving visitors a tour, but we also realized that we were intruders here. This was its private space, its sanctuary, and we didn't belong. My partner seemed to feel this too because he took a step back and gave a small bow, just a slight inclination of his head, acknowledging the creature in its own domain. The creature's eyes met his, then mine, and I swear it understood the gesture. There was recognition there, gratitude, perhaps even a kind of respect. It nodded back, a single deliberate movement, and settled itself deeper into its bed. We quietly backed out, retreating out of the cave and carefully rearranging the camouflage so the entrance was hidden again. Neither of us spoke until we were well away from the area, both of us processing what we had just experienced. The hike back to our truck was surreal. We kept stopping to look back, half expecting to see the creature following us, or to wake up and find out the whole thing had been some kind of hypothermia-induced hallucination. But the evidence was there in our first aid kit, used supplies, missing gauze and antiseptic. The creature's blood was still on our gloves. The discussion we had on the way back to town changed both of our lives. We knew we couldn't tell anyone about what we had found. The scientific community would go wild trying to study it. The media would turn it into a circus, and the creature would lose the privacy and security it needed to recover. But we also couldn't just walk away and pretend nothing had happened. The creature was badly injured, facing the worst part of winter in a remote location. We had no idea what kind of food reserves it might have, or if it would be able to hunt and forage in its current condition. Looking at that cave, we hadn't seen any signs of stored food. No caches of preserved meat, no stashes of nuts or dried fruit. Everything suggested it lived day to day, hunting and gathering as needed. In its current condition, that wasn't going to be possible. It couldn't travel far from the cave, couldn't chase prey or even forage effectively. Without intervention, it would likely starve before its wounds healed enough for it to become mobile again. We made a decision that day that we stuck to for the rest of that winter. We would make regular supply runs into the area, bringing food and any other supplies that might help it survive the recovery period. We didn't know exactly what it ate, but we figured it was probably an omnivore like early humans would have been: meat, fruit, vegetables, whatever it could find in the wild. The logistics were challenging. We were talking about hiking 40 miles into the wilderness every few days, carrying significant amounts of food without raising suspicion from our supervisors or fellow workers. We devised a system where we'd take turns claiming to be on extended solo patrols to check on remote areas affected by storm damage. The first supply run was 2 days later. We brought a variety of things: canned meat, dried fruit, nuts, vegetables that would keep in the cold. We didn't dare go back to the cave entrance. We didn't want to disturb the creature or make it feel like its territory was being invaded. Instead, we found a spot about 50 yards away in a small clearing that would be visible from the cave, but not obvious to any other animals that might pass by. We left the supplies there and marked the spot by arranging some stones in a small cairn, figuring the creature was smart enough to notice the marker and investigate. Then we left and returned 3 days later to see what had happened. The food was gone, all of it. The cairn had been dismantled and rebuilt in a slightly different pattern, like a message saying the gift had been received and understood. We took it as confirmation that our plan was working. This became our routine for the rest of the winter. Every few days, one of us would make the long hike back to the supply drop location, bringing what food we could manage. We tried to vary the offerings, sometimes canned goods, sometimes fresh meat from our own hunting, sometimes fruits and vegetables we bought in town and could transport without them spoiling. We never saw the creature during these supply runs, but there were signs that it was getting better. The food always disappeared within a day or two of being left, and sometimes we'd find tracks in the snow around the drop site. Not the hesitant, pained tracks we had followed that first day, but more confident prints that suggested improved mobility. After about 3 weeks of this routine, we found something new at the drop site. Small objects made of woven twigs and grass. For more interesting stories, check out this.